The termination notice had already been slipped under the break room door when Adrian Mercer walked out of Northgate General Hospital for the last time, carrying nothing except a child's drawing. A lopsided yellow house with two stick figures in the yard that his 9-year-old son had tucked into his lab coat pocket that morning, before school. Behind him, department heads murmured that he had finally broken under pressure. Some said he was reckless. Others said it was inevitable, that a man who kept leaving early and asking for schedule changes was never really serious about his career. But none of them knew what had happened the night before. None of them had seen him sitting in an empty hospital corridor at midnight, staring at a voicemail from his son's school counselor, saying that Ben had cried in class again, and told his teacher that he didn't think his dad was ever coming home. If you've ever felt like you were disappearing inside a job, while the people who needed you most were waiting somewhere just out of reach, this story is for you. Adrian Mercer had spent 11 years as a respiratory therapist at Northgate General, a mid-sized hospital in Hamilton, Ontario, that had grown considerably since he joined as a quiet, methodical young man fresh out of college. He was not the loudest person in any room. He was not the one who stayed late for drinks with the supervisors or angled for committee positions. He was the one who noticed when a patient's oxygen saturation dropped 2 points before the monitors alarmed. He was the one other staff called on nights when a ventilator was behaving strangely, and nobody else could figure out why. He was, without anyone ever officially saying so, the person the respiratory department quietly depended on. His wife, Claire, had died 22 months earlier from a brain aneurysm that gave no warning. They had been married for 9 years. Ben had been 7 when it happened. One morning she was making oatmeal and complaining that the kitchen tap was dripping again. By the afternoon, she was in the ICU of the very hospital where Adrian worked, and by the following morning she was gone. Adrian had stood in the hallway of his own workplace in street clothes, listening to a doctor he knew professionally deliver news that rearranged every fact of his life. He went back to work 12 days later because he didn't know what else to do with himself. Grief, for Adrian, expressed itself as motion. He filled every available hour with shifts. He volunteered for overnight call. He covered colleagues during holidays. In retrospect, he understood that he was trying to outrun something that had no intention of being outrun. And while he was running, Ben was home with a rotating schedule of babysitters, then an after-school program, then a neighbor who charged by the hour and watched television loudly until Adrian got back. The trouble started accumulating slowly, the way water damage does, invisible until it isn't. Ben began having nightmares. Then he started wetting the bed again, which he hadn't done since he was 4. His teacher sent home a note in October saying Ben had become withdrawn. Adrian read it at the hospital between patients, folded it carefully, put it in his pocket, and finished his shift. He told himself he would deal with it on the weekend. But the weekends kept filling up too. There was the morning Adrian missed Ben's first hockey game because a colleague called in sick and management said there was nobody else available. Ben had scored his first goal that day. Adrian found out from the other boy's father, who had filmed it on his phone and sent a video. Adrian watched it 4 times in the hospital parking lot before going inside. He never told Ben he'd seen it secondhand. There was the Thursday in January, when Adrian arrived at the after-school program 17 minutes after closing time, because a patient had gone into acute respiratory failure at 4:40 in the afternoon. He found sitting outside on a bench, in -12-degree weather, his coat zipped to his chin, holding his backpack in both arms. The program director was standing beside him, with the stiff, pointed posture of someone preparing to file a complaint. Ben didn't cry. He just looked at Adrian and said, very quietly, "I knew you'd come." That sentence was worse than any anger would have been. That night, after Ben was asleep, Adrian sat at the kitchen table and looked at the stack of papers he'd been meaning to sort for 3 weeks. Bills, school forms, a card from Claire's mother that he hadn't been able to open yet. He looked at the chair across from him where Claire used to sit with a mug of tea she always let go cold. He thought about what he was actually giving Ben, beyond logistics. He thought about the last time they had laughed together over something stupid, the last time he had sat on Ben's bedroom floor, and just listened to whatever the boy was going on about. He couldn't remember, and that was when something shifted in him that couldn't be shifted back. He submitted a formal request the following week, asking for a modified schedule. No shifts ending after 6, no emergency callouts during school hours unless the situation was genuinely critical. He framed it carefully. He cited the research on grief and child development. He noted his 11 years of service and his clean record. His immediate supervisor, a practical woman named Gail, read it and told him she'd pass it along to the department director. The department director was Dr. Pauline Voss. Pauline Voss had been brought in 18 months earlier to restructure the clinical support divisions at Northgate General after a provincial audit flagged the hospital for staffing inefficiencies. She was 51 years old, had a doctorate in health administration, and had spent most of her career rebuilding institutions that had grown comfortable with mediocrity. She had a reputation, which preceded her to Hamilton the way weather systems do, something large and cold moving in from the north. Staff meetings ran faster after she arrived. Departments that had operated loosely for years suddenly found themselves with metrics and timelines. People who had coasted quietly for a decade began updating their resumes. She was not cruel. That was the complicated part. She was simply operating from a framework in which systems were more important than individuals, and individuals were more reliably understood as functions within systems. A respiratory therapist with 11 years of institutional knowledge was an asset. An asset requesting reduced availability was an inefficiency. The logic was clean, and produced an answer before the human question was ever fully asked. Adrian's request was denied within a week. The response came through Gail, not directly from Pauline, which Adrian found grimly instructive. The language was careful. Operational requirements, equitable scheduling policy, available resources through the Employee Assistance Program. He read it twice, then put it in the same folder as Ben's teacher's note. He requested a meeting with Pauline directly. She gave him 12 minutes between 2 other appointments. He sat across from her in a chair that was slightly too low for the desk and made his case again, this time without the written framework, just plainly. He told her about Ben, he told her about the bench in January, he told her that he wasn't asking to work less, only differently, and that he had never once called in sick without a genuine reason in 11 years. Pauline listened. She had good eye contact. She took a note or two. Then she told him that she sympathized with his situation, that parenting as a sole provider was genuinely difficult, and that the hospital had resources available to support employees through life transitions. She said the scheduling request wasn't something she could accommodate without opening similar requests across the department. She said it with the careful warmth of someone who had practiced delivering disappointing news without appearing responsible for it. Adrian thanked her and left. In the elevator going down, he stared at his own reflection in the brushed steel doors and thought, I am going to be replaced by this job before my son is old enough to remember me properly. He resigned the following Monday. He had 4 months of savings, and no plan beyond it. His father, who lived 40 minutes away in Ancassetester, offered to help with Ben when he could. Adrian took on 2 private clients through a home respiratory care agency. People with COPD and sleep apnea who needed equipment management and periodic check-ins. It paid less than a third of his hospital salary. He started going to the grocery store with a calculator. But he was home by 3:30 every afternoon when Ben got off the bus. He was there for dinner every night. He helped with homework at the kitchen table and discovered that his son had developed a consuming interest in weather systems. Could explain the difference between a cold front and a warm front, had started keeping a journal of daily temperatures and cloud formations, wanted to be a meteorologist. Adrian hadn't known any of this. He had been present in the house without being present in his son's life, and those are not the same thing at all. They started cooking together on Sunday afternoons. Ben was surprisingly precise in the kitchen for a 9-year-old. Measuring things carefully and taking the process seriously, in a way that made Adrian think of Claire, who had been the same. They made the same pasta 3 weeks in a row, because Ben wanted to get it right before moving on. Adrian let him. On the 4th Sunday, Ben declared the pasta perfect, and they had it for dinner with a formality that bordered on ceremony, and both of them laughed so hard, Ben knocked over his orange juice and neither of them cared. Adrian didn't tell people this part. He didn't tell anyone about the Saturday morning in March when he and Ben drove out to Cootes Paradise in the early light and sat by the water watching the bird migration, Ben with his little notebook, and didn't say anything at all for almost an hour. And how that silence was the most at peace Adrian had felt in almost 2 years. He kept those things quietly, the way you keep things that are too true to share with people who might reduce them. The money problem, however, did not keep quietly. By the end of April, the savings were almost gone. He sold the spare car, Claire's old hatchback that he'd been meaning to deal with for a year. He called the bank about the mortgage and was told, in the pleasant language of financial institutions, that there were options, none of which were options he wanted. He started accepting every private client the agency sent him, which meant some early mornings and some evenings, which meant his father making the drive to Ancaster more than he'd promised. He did not go back to the hospital. That door, he had decided, was closed. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in early May, a ventilator failed. Not a metaphorical failure, an actual device malfunction, a Medtronic PB840 that had been behaving intermittently for weeks in the hospital's post-surgical step-down unit, flagged twice in maintenance logs, never fully resolved. The machine was supporting a 63-year-old man recovering from open-heart surgery when it alarmed at 2:17 in the afternoon, and then, 6 minutes later, stopped alarming because it stopped doing most of what it was supposed to do. The respiratory team responded. Engineers were called. The equipment vendor's technical support line was put on hold for 18 minutes. 3 therapists stood around the machine doing everything the manual said. The patient, whose name was Gerald, was manually ventilated for 2 hours, while the hospital tried to solve a problem that refused to be solved. Pauline Voss received a call at 3:45 from the VP of Clinical Operations. She was told the situation was under control, in the way that people say things are under control when they are not. She made 3 calls of her own, then walked down to the step-down unit and stood in the corridor looking through the window at a team of professionals working very hard to maintain a situation that should not have become critical in the first place. She asked her assistant to pull the maintenance log for the ventilator. She also, on an instinct she couldn't entirely explain, asked for the personnel file of every respiratory therapist who had resigned from Northgate General in the previous 18 months. There was only one name. She knew it before she opened the file. She thought about the 12-minute meeting, the chair that was too low, the note she had taken, on a yellow legal pad, and then put in a folder she had not reopened. She thought about the phrase she had used, life transition, and how it had been, now that she examined it honestly, in a fluorescent-lit corridor, while a man was being manually ventilated 40 feet away, the most bloodless possible description of a widower trying to keep his child from going to sleep alone in an empty house every night. She drove to Adrian's address that evening. She hadn't called ahead. She told herself it was because she didn't want to give him the opportunity to decline the conversation. In truth, she wasn't sure what she was offering yet. The neighborhood was not what she expected, though she realized afterward she hadn't examined what she was expecting. It was a small street in the East End, older houses, deep lots, a few mature maples that hadn't leafed out yet. Adrian's house was a red brick semi, with a weather vane on the porch that she suspected was Ben's. The lights were on inside. Through the front window she could see the blue flicker of a television. She knocked. Adrian opened the door in a gray Henley and work socks, holding a dish towel, and looked at her the way a person looks at something that doesn't fit the category of what they were expecting. He said her name as a question. Behind him, a boy appeared at the end of the hallway, small, dark-haired, wearing a t-shirt with a cloud formation diagram on it. He looked at Pauline with the candid evaluation that children apply to strangers and then said, informatively, to Adrian, "It's a lady." Adrian said, "I can see that, bud." Pauline said she was sorry to arrive without calling. She asked if she could have a few minutes. He studied her for a moment. Then he opened the door wider and stepped back, and she understood that this was not an invitation so much as a permission, which was a distinction she hadn't been required to navigate in quite some time. The living room was small and inhabited. Toys in a basket by the couch, a topographic map of Ontario taped to the wall with string and pins, marking weather stations, Ben's school projects arranged on a shelf with what appeared to be deliberate pride of place. Family photographs everywhere, Claire. Pauline understood, looking at a framed photo above the mantel, dark-eyed, laughing, caught mid-sentence in some summer yard. The house did not feel like a house where a person had given up. It felt like a house where a person was trying very hard to hold something together. Ben reappeared with a bowl of crackers, which he offered to Pauline with the seriousness of a diplomat presenting credentials. She accepted one. He sat on the end of the couch and began sorting the remaining crackers by size, listening without appearing to listen. Pauline explained what had happened with the ventilator. She was precise about it: the timeline, the failure mode, the 2 hours of manual ventilation, the outcome, which was, thankfully, that Gerald had stabilized. She watched Adrian listen. He didn't look triumphant, he just looked tired in the specific way of someone absorbing a thing they'd already half expected. She told him the hospital needed him back. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Gerald almost didn't make it because of a machine that was on the maintenance log twice. That wasn't an equipment problem. That was a prioritization problem, and a staffing problem, and probably a documentation problem that nobody's going to want to put in writing." She said he was right. He said that he wasn't going back to a situation where his schedule was treated as a variable that only moved in one direction. She said she understood. He looked at her more carefully then. He said, "Do you?" It was not a challenge, exactly. It was the way someone asks a question when they've been given polite answers to it before, and have become precise about the difference. Pauline thought about the legal pad folder. She thought about 12 minutes. She thought about standing in that corridor and looking at Gerald through the glass and understanding, with the uncomfortable clarity that crises sometimes produce, that she had built a very efficient system that had just nearly killed someone, because it didn't have room for us who actually knew how to prevent that. She said, "I've been operating this department the way I'd operate a budget, and I think I've been wrong about what the unit of analysis should be." It was not an apology. She wasn't sure yet how to make it one. But it was honest, and honesty was something she had practiced less than she once thought. Ben, who had apparently finished sorting his crackers to his satisfaction, looked up at this point and asked Pauline if she knew what kind of clouds were in the sky right now. She said she didn't. He said they were altocumulus. He said this meant the weather was probably going to change in the next 24 to 48 hours. He said it with the satisfaction of someone delivering useful information. Pauline looked at this boy, his father's serious eyes, his mother in the shape of his face, and felt something she could not have named efficiently rearrange itself somewhere behind her sternum. She drove home through a light spring rain, exactly as Ben had forecasted, and sat in her car in the parking garage for a while, before going inside. She had built her career on the premise that institutions could be made to work well, if you removed the inefficiencies that people introduced into them. What she had produced, in practice, was a hospital, where a man who knew more about respiratory equipment than anyone in the department had concluded that his continued employment was incompatible with being present for his son. She had achieved her metrics. Her departments ran on time. She had also, without intending to, sent the message that the correct response to personal catastrophe was to absorb it quietly, and keep performing at full capacity, and that anyone who could not do this was, in the language of HR documentation, failing to meet operational requirements. She was not sleeping well. She hadn't been, she realized, for some time. Over the following 2 weeks, something changed in how she moved through the hospital. She began reading intake forms differently. Noting the small details she had previously scanned past, she attended a staff wellness session that she had previously delegated to her assistant. She sat in the back, she listened. She heard things she had not expected to hear from people she had not expected to hear them from. A nurse who had been at Northgate for 16 years described the experience of filing a support request and receiving, in response, a pamphlet. A physiotherapist said she'd had 2 colleagues leave in the past year who she was certain would have stayed if someone had asked one real question at the right moment. Pauline returned to Adrian's house on a Friday evening, 3 weeks after the first visit. It was warmer this time. The maple out front had leafed out fully. The Ben was in the driveway with a kite that wasn't cooperating, and he waved at Pauline with the uncomplicated recognition of someone who has already filed you under friendly. She and Adrian sat on the back porch while Ben ran the kite back and forth along the side of the house in the failing light. She had brought a folder, not a contract. She had learned something from the first conversation. It was a document she'd drafted herself, without legal review, without the HR department, without the careful, institutional language that had, she now understood, a way of making people feel processed rather than heard. It outlined what she was proposing to change: flexible scheduling for parents and caregivers across all clinical support departments, a formal review of maintenance escalation protocols, an employee support structure that involved actual conversation rather than pamphlets, and a position for Adrian specifically: senior clinical specialist, restructured hours, no mandatory on-call during school hours, compensation adjusted to reflect the knowledge differential between his role and what was currently being paid to people doing substantially less. She told him she had also written a letter of acknowledgement, separate from the proposal, that she intended to share with the department. Not because it was required, because she thought it was owed. Adrian read through the document carefully. He was quiet for a while. On the lawn, Ben had finally gotten the kite airborne and was watching it with the focused solemnity of an air traffic controller. Adrian said, "Why are you doing this?" She said, "Because I was wrong, and because Gerald is recovering well and wants to send a card to the team, and when I told him what happened, he said that he hoped the person who knew how to fix it would come back." Adrian almost smiled at that. He said, "If I come back and this document turns into policy language that means nothing, I'll leave again. I'm not going to trade Ben's evenings for a line in an HR handbook." She said she knew that. He said, "I need you to know that I'm not the same person you met in that office in February. I'm not going to accommodate things that can't be accommodated." She said, "That's why I want you back. The person who accommodated everything wasn't actually functioning at full capacity. He was just making it easy for us not to notice." That was the truest thing Pauline Voss had said in a professional context in several years. She knew it when she said it. It had the slightly vertiginous quality of honesty often has when it arrives after a long absence. Adrian looked out at Ben, who had begun explaining the kite's altitude to himself in a low, running commentary. Then he looked back at Pauline and said, "Okay, just that." "Okay." Ben, who had not appeared to be listening, pumped his fist. He came back to Northgate General on the first Monday of June. His schedule was Tuesdays through Saturdays 7 a.m. to 3:30 p.m., with Mondays reserved for the private home care clients he'd decided to keep two of: an older woman in Dundas, who had become genuinely fond of him, and a retired teacher with a tracheotomy who was teaching Ben chess by correspondence, which was a development that delighted everyone. He was home by 4 o'clock. He was at the bus stop when Ben got off. The changes Pauline implemented moved slowly. At first, the way institutional changes do. There was resistance. There always is from people who have organized their own behavior around a system's demands and feel obscurely criticized when the system changes. But there were also people who had been waiting. The nurse who'd mentioned the pamphlet filed a genuine support request and got a genuine response. Two therapists who had quietly planned to leave decided to stay and told Pauline directly why. The maintenance escalation protocol was rewritten in language that made ignoring a flagged issue significantly more documentable and significantly less avoidable. 6 months after Adrian returned, Northgate General's respiratory department had the lowest incident rate in the province among comparably sized hospitals. Pauline did not make a large announcement about this. She sent Adrian a brief email with the data attached. He replied with a cloud formation photograph Ben had taken that morning, a textbook altocumulus, cleanly defined against a pale November sky, and the words, "He says it means the weather is changing." She printed it and put it on her desk. The question people sometimes ask, when they hear a story like this one, is whether it was worth it. Whether Adrian was right to walk away from 11 years, without a plan, whether the risk was proportionate, whether it all could have been resolved, without anyone resigning, or any ventilators failing. It's a reasonable question. It doesn't have a clean answer. What Adrian would tell you, if you asked him directly, is that the evening in January when he found Ben on that bench in the cold, was the moment everything clarified for him. Not because it was the worst moment, but because it was the moment he understood that he had been treating his son's need for him as a problem to be managed, rather than a life to be lived together. He had been so deep inside the machinery of getting through each day, that he'd forgotten what the days were supposed to be for. What Pauline might tell you, if she was being honest, and she has gotten better at that, is that she walked into Adrian's house expecting to conduct a negotiation, and walked out, carrying a question she hadn't gone in with. What kind of institution have I built, and what does it cost the people inside it that never shows up in a report? Ben, for his part, will tell you about the kite. He got it properly airborne that evening for the first time, just as the light was going, and it climbed so high, it was barely visible against the deepening sky, and he stood in the yard watching it with his arms out, slightly from his sides, holding the string, his face tipped up. His father was on the porch watching him. The woman from the hospital was watching too, and for a few minutes there was just the sound of the kite in the wind, and the particular quality of light that comes just before dark in a Canadian spring. When everything goes still and blue, and even the air seems to be paying attention. The strongest people are not the ones who never come undone. They are the ones who let themselves be put back together, and who have the grace to rebuild something better from the pieces.